In this final video of this module, I'm going to discuss ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is an ethical theory. It tries to tell us not how people do behave, but how people should or morally may behave. So one way to put it, basically the ethical egoist says that your only obligation, if there are any, is to your own self-interest. So one way to formulate this is to say that you should do whatever is in your self-interest. Or, perhaps slightly differently, you may do whatever is in your self-interest and there are no other obligations that you have. So these are more or less, we won't worry about distinguishing between these two, but there are two different ways of putting this basic idea, that insofar as there are any ethical obligations, they're only to your own self and your own self-interest. So a couple of questions we might ask about ethical egoism. Is it correct or is it incorrect? And can we prove our answer? So there aren't great arguments for ethical egoism, and so we're not going to try to provide any. We're going to have ethical egoism more as a foil to consider when we're thinking about non-egoistic ethical theories. There is, however, an argument against ethical egoism, and that's what we'll be focused on and seeing what we think about that argument for the rest of this video, basically. So I want to introduce this phrase, intuitive morality. So we have lots of moral disagreements, but we also have a lot of actually more or less shared moral views, and they are what make up intuitive morality. So according to intuitive morality, at least some purely altruistic actions are morally required. If you are walking along and there's you see a child who's about to run into the street, and you can just stop the child, there's nothing else going on. If the child runs into the street, they're going to be killed. You should stop the child from running into the street. Some purely egoistic actions are not permitted. You can't shove the child into the street, even if you would enjoy seeing the carnage that would result, which you wouldn't, but even if you would, it still wouldn't be okay. Are all purely altruistic actions morally required? Are all purely egoistic actions not permitted? That's not so obvious, but according to intuitive morality, in at least some situations, you should do the purely altruistic action. You should sacrifice at least a little bit to assist others and not harm others, and so we all more or less believe that. So we can then turn that into an argument against ethical egoism. So if ethical egoism is true, then purely altruistic actions are never morally required. You always, if there are any obligations on ethical egoism, they're always just to yourself, so you never require to sacrifice in any way for anybody else. And purely egoistic actions are always okay. That's if ethical egoism is true. But according to intuitive morality, that's not the case. Some purely altruistic actions are required, and some purely egoistic actions are not permitted, and so ethical egoism and intuitive morality are straightforwardly incompatible. And intuitive morality is correct, that's the other premise, and it follows that ethical egoism is incorrect. Now there are two ways in which the ethical egoist might respond to this. They might try to deny either of these claims on the middle row. So the ethical egoist might say, no, ethical egoism is too compatible with intuitive morality. They might say, and some ethical egoists have tried to say this, they think that ethical egoism does not permit antisocial behavior. Why? Well, because antisocial actions always have social costs on the agent, namely the reputational costs. And the claim is that those social costs are always worse than whatever benefit you might get by doing the antisocial action. The idea is to leverage the social contract, is to say, well, ethical egoism is true, but because of the social contract, it's always in your interest to do the altruistic, to act in accordance with the social contract. But this just isn't true, as we saw, right? The Ring of Gyges gives us a very straightforward example of a situation where it's in your self-interest to not act in accordance with the social contract, and more generally, the egoist will violate the social contract if they can get away with it, and there are situations where they can, and the ethical egoist says, oh, they're doing the right thing, and that means that, but that means that's the conflict with intuitive morality, right? So is it always, for there to be no conflict between ethical egoism and intuitive morality, it always needs to be in my self-interest to do the intuitively moral thing, and that's just not true. Because there are times, why? Well, if those two coincided, it would be because of the social contract, but the social contract can't make them always coincide because we're not perfect at detecting cheating. The second reply by the ethical egoist would be to say, oh, well, intuitive morality is too mistaken. You're right. Intuitive morality and ethical egoism are incompatible, but we should get rid of intuitive morality and hold on to ethical egoism. So, well, why would we think that that's true? Why should we reject intuitive morality? We believe it, most of us, so why ethical egoists should we reject it? What's the reason for thinking it's false? Well, Nietzsche, who we'll be reading a little bit later, was not an egoist, but did think that in certain ways intuitive morality was mistaken. And we'll see this later, and we'll see what we think about his argument. But even he's not giving an argument, as we'll see, for ethical egoism. So, if we think no intuitive morality is correct, the ethical egoist needs to give us an argument for rejecting it. We might then turn the tables and ask, well, can we refute ethical egoism, right? That's what this argument is supposed to be doing, right? Is there an argument for intuitive morality and against ethical egoism which is sound and whose premises are rationally self-evident, where if you're a rational person, you consider the premises and you say, yes, they're true. Well, we'll see some different answers to this question over the next few units. What I want to do in the remainder of this video is explain Rachel's view that while ethical egoism is false, we can't refute it. Rachel's thinks that intuitive morality is true, and he thinks you can know that it's true, but he also thinks you may not be able to prove that it's true to the ethical egoist. So what's going on here? Let's consider an analogy. So let's think about a shirt. So let's suppose that I'm colorblind. I'm not, but suppose that I was. And you're not. And let's suppose that your shirt is blue, and you know that your shirt is blue because you can see it. Can you prove to me that your shirt is blue? It seems like in this situation you cannot prove to me that your shirt is blue. Could you? Well, how could you? I mean, probably not. Your color vision gives you access to its blueness. I don't have that color vision, so you can't say just look at it. And you can't prove to the colorblind person that your color vision is accurate, right? I mean, you're relying on it, it works for you, but how do you prove to someone who doesn't have it that it works? It's hard to, maybe in some situations you might be able to, but not in general. So it's still blue, you know it, but you can't prove it to somebody else because you have this way of finding out about color that other people don't. So more generally, what this shows is there are different kinds of false beliefs. Some are irrational, and some are not. So if I believed that your shirt was red, maybe I have lots of evidence that it's red, but the evidence is misleading. So my belief would be false, your shirt is blue, but it wouldn't be irrational. I have lots of evidence for it. It's just that the evidence isn't correct, and I don't have the very best kind of evidence that I could. So Rachel thinks that that's sort of what's going on in the ethical situation. Others' welfare, it's intrinsically valuable, meaning that it's valuable for its own sake and not for the sake of some further value. So for example, right, other people's welfare, oh, it's of value to me because promoting it maintains my reputation, which keeps me in the social contract, which benefits me. No, it's just valuable in and of itself. Maybe it's also valuable for the sake of some further value, but when we say it's intrinsically valuable, we're saying it's valuable for itself. It itself is good, independent of anything else that's good. And because others' welfare is intrinsically valuable, Rachel thinks we should act purely altruistically, right? It promotes this value. When we act purely altruistically, we benefit others, and that's intrinsically valuable. But he thinks there's no argument to prove that others' welfare is intrinsically valuable. How do I know about the value of other people's welfare? My human fellow feeling. Sympathy, empathy, my ability to put myself in other people's shoes and understand what it's like for them and to, as it were, feel their pain or feel their happiness. To consider the analogy with the shirt situation, what that means is that just like you have color vision, you have value vision. Just like you can see colors, so you can perceive the value of other people's welfare. And the ethical egoist, just like someone might be colorblind, the ethical egoist is value blind. They lack the ability to detect or respond or get the value of other people's of other people's welfare. That they lack human fellow feeling. They lack the ability to empathize and sympathize in certain ways with other people. They just don't get it. Just like someone who's colorblind just doesn't, in a certain way, get color. So the ethical egoist just doesn't get this value that other people have, and that actually makes them a psychopath. That's what basically being a psychopath is. But can you prove them wrong? No, right? Just like you can't if you have color vision, you can't prove to someone without color vision facts about colors. So if you have value vision and someone else lacks value vision, you can't prove facts about values. So that's the way Rachel thinks it works. That ethical egoism is false. Other people have intrinsic value, but the way we know that other people have intrinsic value is kind of like perception and not like reasoning. We have value vision. And if you lack value vision, well, you can't tell that other people have value. That's not an impairment in your thinking, it's an impairment in your sympathy and empathy and perception of the world. Okay, so what are we going to do going forward? Well, we're going to be doing some more ethical theory, and looking at particular ethical theories, and they're going to assume that we do share a substantial amount of intuitive morality, and that intuitive morality is more or less correct. Not maybe accurate in every way, but more or less correct. We would need a reason to reject it, and the ethical egoist hasn't given us one. And the ethical theories are going to try to make intuitive morality systematic, and in particular are going to focus on fundamental value or values and ask the question, what is the most important and most basic value? And they may try to prove those values really are values, or they may be more with Rachel's and say, look, I'm going to make some claims about these values, and I'm going to assume that you can verify them for yourself, but maybe I'm not going to be able to prove them to you. And so the first theory that we'll be looking at in the next unit is called utilitarianism, and we'll see what that's like then.